Well, for better or worse, I don't have any technology, so there are no slides to worry about our system on. And also, I want to preface my remarks by making clear that I'm not in any way an expert on AI. What I know a little bit about is international politics and how states form agreements or fail to. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Tuan asked me to say a bit about the international and geopolitical dimensions of this. And I'm going to basically report on a meeting that was held in Aspen this summer of the Aspen Strategy Group, which I co-chair with Condoleezza Rice. It's a bipartisan group, and the topic was the international aspects of AI. And I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what people discovered or concluded at that meeting, and with a comment or two of my own. One thing that was important that we started with, and this is a point that Michael Horowitz makes in an issue that's in the current article in the current issue, Foreign Policy, is as we talk about AI, it's very important to remember that AI is not one thing, and that it is a dual-use technology. It's not a weapon, and that basically we have to think about it in ways that are distinctive for AI. So before I make some of the comparisons I want to make sure that we understand that. We started out in the discussions at the Aspen Strategy Group about asking how was AI going to affect competition between countries, the global balance of power, and the international conflict, and so forth. And there, a great deal of attention has been drawn to the US-Chinese competition in AI. Xi Jinping has said that by 2030, China will be the world's leader in AI, passing the United States. Eric Schmidt, formerly of Alphabet, Google, who was with us at this meeting, said he believes that Xi is right, that China will be ahead of the US, or could be ahead of the US by 2030 in AI. And certainly that has very much caught the attention of the United States Congress, which has been trying to take a number of steps to deal with this. Now, and there was a very interesting paper by a British entrepreneur in AI, said that while he is a scientist and entrepreneur, did not think this should be polluted by the geopolitics of states, that if he stepped back and looked at the world today, he would be remiss if he didn't say there is an AI race. So there's a lot of steps the states are taking are based on this premise that there is a race for geopolitical advantage that is summarized by this Xi Jinping statement, and that leads to a number of policies. For example, one type of policy that might come from this is, to what extent do you want Chinese students in laboratories at MIT and Caltech? Traditionally, we have regarded the openness of our universities as essential to our free liberal system. But if somebody essentially takes the latest technology home in the wetware of his brain, and it helps China get a leg up on something, should that be permitted? Right now, of course, the Congress has passed a law updating the CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And the CFIUS regulations are being updated to prevent China and other countries, but particularly China, purchasing American startups, where they would be purchasing them not because of the great economic opportunity to exploit them in the American market, but because they want access to the technology and they're going to take it back to China. So Congress has already passed a law about this. Will they want to go further? Should we go further with other types of measures, such as restricting access for students or visas if they're going to compete in the area of AI? My own view on this is no, but it's an illustration of how the idea of an AI arms race and geopolitical competition in AI can have profound effects on our society. I mean, of what we think of as a free and open university structure. So on that, I might give you a quick summation of whether people thought this prediction was going to occur, that China will be ahead of it on AI by 2030, as Xi Jinping has expressed. The feeling here was that it wasn't all that clear. The general argument that people make is that since China has more data, simply more people, 1.4 billion of them, and since it has very little concern about privacy, I don't think it's a China edict as far as I'm aware, therefore they're less constrained about the use of the data, and that China, therefore, when it turns machines loose to learn as machines, and to go deep into neural learning, which they can't fully explain, there are fewer constraints. Whereas in Europe and the United States, there will be constraints. Therefore, Chinese machines will develop more sophisticated algorithms sooner than the West. And that whatever measures we might put on about putting in a code with an ethical layer, such as Matthias was talking about, what makes us think China will do the same thing? And if it doesn't, will then China have this geopolitical advantage? The riposte to that, or the opposite view, was the Chinese might be particularly good at AI for certain purposes, let's say mass surveillance, to go back to what we just heard. It doesn't mean they're good at all types of AI. And the interesting question will be whether a centralized system like the Chinese system will be better than a market system which has many entrepreneurs who will try many things that don't work, but nonetheless one of those things will turn out to be extremely important. An example of this is Shale Revolution in the United States, where the shale rock had always existed, and the technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing were not new, but it wasn't the government with central direction. It was an entrepreneur in Texas who decided to stake his fortune on it, indeed almost lost it, and that basically unleashed the Shale Revolution. Will there be an equivalent in AI? The Chinese, with their central direction and concern about surveillance, will move very quickly in one direction, but there'll be lots of other directions which will be less politically attractive to the central authorities, and yet it will be one of those. Many of them will may be the particular breakthrough in a particular area. So in that sense, I think the conclusion of the group after talking about the AI arms race was it's uncertain. it's indeterminate, and that statements about China will or will not exceed the United States in AI by 2030, that will tip the global balance of power. Much too simple and it's very premature to make those sorts of statements. So that was one type of thing we looked at, which is this large geopolitical competition. Another thing we looked at was the question of, which we touched on a little bit this afternoon, which is what about the idea of agreements or treaties which limited AI? There was an interesting discussion of what AI is doing to warfare, and clearly one of the things it's doing is unleashing the idea of swarm warfare, where you'll have massive numbers with a great deal of autonomy and offensive and defensive weapons. And the question of what will that mean for theories of just war, the laws of armed conflict, the distinction between civilians and military and so forth. And again, there are lots of worries about this. We looked at an article by Douglas France that was in the Los Angeles Times this summer, in which the article was entitled, "We've unleashed AI and now we need a treaty to control it." The interesting question there was that France said the key is to make sure humans remain in command, and we've heard that concern this afternoon. And so what we need is some international institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency in the nuclear area, which will essentially monitor the various programs in AI in different countries. So we would have, in a sense, open inspection of algorithms. So we're asking, does an algorithm, does a chip have a layer, let's call it the ethical layer that Matthias talked about, and therefore can we get transparency in that algorithm? This International Atomic Energy Agency equivalent would have the job of inspecting those chips. But of course, the problem here is how will you know what you don't know? After you, how would you verify this? You might say, well, the IAEA on nuclear issues goes to declared plants and asks, have they misused their civilian nuclear facilities to produce weapons-grade materials? And so this international algorithm transparency agency would go and look at whether Chinese, Russians, and other algorithms that are being used in various systems, particularly weapons systems, have this, let's say, the ethical layer, or designed in such a way that they can be made transparent. But how would you know whether they had declared all their facilities? It's a little bit like the problem of North Korean nuclear weapons right now. North Koreans can say, we'll destroy a certain amount of nuclear weapons. How do you know about the ones they didn't destroy, or how many there are overall? So the feeling we had, the difficulties of verification made the treaty approach very difficult. I have recently been looking back at cases where the world has tried to cope with a new disruptive technology and asked what sorts of control mechanisms were reached internationally. And of course, the classic is nuclear weapons, which came on the scene in 1945. And there's a pattern here. The first effort was to have a big treaty in the United Nations. The United States fielded the Baruch Plan, to have international control of nuclear weapons. What's interesting is that the extent to which there's nuclear arms control, that's not how it happened. The Russians rejected that, or the Soviets rejected it. It wasn't until 1962, when you had the Limited Test Ban Treaty, banning that explosions in the atmosphere, that you had your first agreement. That's nearly 20 years later. And that, of course, was really as much about the environment as it was about weapons. And in 1968, you had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then in 1972, you finally had the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty between the two superpowers. So it takes a long time. And the first efforts are not ones which go to the heart of the problem. The other area I've looked at, and I've written a little paper that has been published in Cybersecurity, a peer-reviewed journal called Normative Restraints on Cyber Conflict. And what's interesting there, when you look at cyber as a precedent for AI, is it starts with the Russians going to the United Nations in 1998 and declaring that they want a treaty to cover all, they don't call it cyber, they call it information technology. The US resists that on the grounds that it's not verifiable. And, but we do agree to creation of a group of government experts under the UN auspices, which works for about a decade. There are several versions of it, but in 2015, this UNGGE brings out a report, which is quite interesting. It has some draft norms. Now, what does it do when it gets to the problem that it can't verify a weapons ban? It's impossible to really ban certain types of cyber weapons. The same code can be used as a weapon or a non-weapon, and it's dependent on the intent of the user. But you can't say ab initio, this is a weapon and that's not a weapon. So you can't say, here's a stockpile of weapons that you would ban. So what the UNGG did was, instead of focusing on the weapons, they focused on the targets. And they developed a set of norms saying you cannot target civilian infrastructure in peacetime. And they borrowed the normative structure on this from the existing laws of armed conflict, which make a distinction between civilian and military targets. And that was enshrined in the 2015 report of the UNGGE, which was later adopted by not only the General Assembly, but by the group of 20 most important economies in the world. The problem with it is that Russia, which signed it later in the year 2015 as a Christmas present for Ukraine, interfered with their electrical grid and shut down Ukraine's electrical grid. And then, of course, in 2016, they interfered with our election. And so even though the Russians had signed this set of principles, it didn't restrict them from their behavior. And that then raises the question which I address in the paper that I mentioned, which is, why do states ever pay attention to norms? Why do they ever hold back? In other words, suppose we got a good set of norms for AI, why would states ever restrain themselves? And I found three basic causes of why states sometimes, obviously not always, sometimes are restrained. One is prudence, that the unknown consequences of new technology, unforeseen consequences, and the risks that they may get out of hand can sometimes lead states to restrain themselves. So that you can develop a taboo, such as the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, where we could never get an agreement on no first use of nuclear weapons, but you got in practice a taboo against first use of nuclear weapons. And that was a norm that was based on prudence and the danger of unforeseen consequences. A second reason that states will restrain themselves is reputational costs to their soft power. So for example, if you look at biological weapons, the Biological Weapons Treaty does not have any real verification procedures attached to it. If you are caught with biological weapons or suspect your neighbor is possessing biological weapons, you report it to the UN Security Council. Sounds pretty weak. On the other hand, the costs of being exposed on this are sufficiently great and the benefits sufficiently uncertain that states have not been developing massive biological weapons programs. And the third reason states sometimes will obey a norm is internalization. It may be that within their own domestic societies, a norm becomes popular. I take, for example, the experience with slavery in the 19th century, in which at the beginning of slavery, it was regarded as an acceptable practice, but by the middle of the century, it was not. And that affected the way a number of states behaved in terms of the recognition of the Confederacy or the non-recognition of the Confederacy at the time of the American Civil War. So I think what I would do in concluding this report is to say that previous experiences show us that norms can work. They can work because of prudence or reputation or internalization, but it takes time, decades. And the question is, do we have decades? The interesting issue here is, could these things speed up? Sometimes people talk about a Sputnik moment in international affairs, referring to the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, which suddenly speeded up American reactions in terms of space. And there, the question, or I'll give you another example, is on this limited test ban treaty in 1962, it was speeded up by the fact that strontium-90 was being discovered in mother's milk all around the globe. And that was sufficiently abhorrent that people said, enough of this atmospheric nuclear testing. Didn't stop underground nuclear testing, but atmospheric nuclear testing. And is there an equivalent that might speed up things in this area? Who had Bruce says what will change this is deaths. That right now, the loss of privacy, the loss of the inconvenience of malware, even ransomware, is bad, but not bad enough that people are really strict about hygiene. But he said, when people start dying, or in fairly large numbers, that might change. And the argument here is that when people start hacking in self-driving cars, and this causes a lot of deaths, that might lead to a very different attitude, a Sputnik moment, if you want, or a strontium-90 moment. Another possibility that might do this in terms of AI would be, or particularly a set of weapons, would be if terrorists started using drones. We saw an effort to assassinate the president of Venezuela with a drone, but suppose it becomes widespread. I mean, these drones are not that hard to purchase. You know, they're not that costly. Suppose it becomes widespread, or suppose it becomes known that some of them can be autonomously oriented. Would that change attitudes in a dramatic way? I think as I look into my own conclusions on this, and again, I'm no expert on AI, but to conclude, I'd say that there are certain principles which are important to try to preserve. There is a group of government experts on the convention on certain conventional weapons, which meets in Geneva, which has been trying to look at autonomous weapons. I think that the types of things that we would hope for in the future is not a grand treaty, but various ways to develop norms. We've heard two very interesting proposals for a normative approach this afternoon. But the idea of human control of the loop remains important. The existing doctrine of the U.S. Defense Department is so-called man in the loop. That obviously has to be updated to human in the loop. But the problem is, what does that mean? And is it adequate? If you look at incidents like the shoot down of the KAL airliner in Hades, or the American shoot down of the Iranian commercial airliner, you can see that even when there were humans in the loop, systems provided information which led to large-scale deaths. So what are the ways in which you can try to create loops in which the humans can intervene at appropriate points? And that goes to what the American Navy is doing, which it calls graduated autonomy. Rather than creating a whole set of autonomous weapon systems, you make distinctions between situations where you want to reserve it for human pushing a button to situations where you are fending off a swarm of cruise missiles or drones attacking a carrier or whatever, in which you may want to have certain weapons which are largely autonomous and picking their targets and moving back and forth among the swarm of attackers. And so the question of how do you design that is important in difference. Similarly, you want to design for fail-safe systems which have expiration dates or limits. It's interesting, if you look at the Stuxnet virus, which was used against Iranian centrifuges, originally it was designed just to attack a certain set of Siemens controllers. Unfortunately, they played around with it and escaped in the wild, and the virus became more broadly available. But you can think of weapons which are very narrowly circumscribed in time or task, rather than, even if they're autonomous within those very narrow boundaries. And then I think most important is what we just heard from Mr. Altenberg, is that the degree of transparency in algorithms is crucial. In other words, the question of how do we know what's in these algorithms, there is always going to be the problem of have they declared everything. But nonetheless, the principle of pushing harder that more should be open and transparent seems to be a type of international principle that we would want to build into a code of norms if we ever get that far. So those are my conclusions from having spent time on this issue without being an expert, but putting it in the context of precedents in other weapon systems. And again, I would note that we seem to be at a very early stage of something which is going to take a good deal of time. And that raises the issue of, do we have that time? So let me stop there. Thanks.
We have some hand mics around. Hand mics. Oh.
Joe, thank you very, very much, and thank you all. Lots of food for thought. The usual concerns as we deal with these kinds of issues, but that's why we're here.